Welcome back to the 30th Annual Westheimer Peace Symposium, focusing on peace and the nature of war through a special two-day symposium entitled The Nuclear Threat, Past, Present, Future, in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. For a full schedule of events, please go to wilmington.edu/Westheimer. I'd like to introduce our first plenary speaker, Tina Cordova. Tina will speak today a talk entitled 75 Years in Waiting, the Untold Story of the People of New Mexico Who Were Negatively Impacted by the Trinity Nuclear Test. Ms. Cordova co-founded the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, the TBDC, with the late Fred Tyler in 2005. The mission of the TBDC is to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the unknowing, unwilling, uncompensated, innocent victims of the first nuclear blast on Earth that took place at the Trinity site in south central New Mexico. Ultimately, the goal is the passage of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act amendments to bring much needed health care of the coverage and compensation to those people of New Mexico suffering from the health effects of the Trinity test. Tina herself is a cancer survivor, having been diagnosed with thyroid cancer when she was 39 years old. She is the fourth generation in her family to have cancer since 1945 and lost her father to cancer in 2013. She also has a sister who is undergoing cancer treatment. Tina, thank you very much for joining us today. I welcome you, and I will now turn the lecture over to you.
Good morning, everybody from the land of enchantment. As Tanya said, my name is Tina Cordova, and I'm joining you from Albuquerque, New Mexico, although I grew up in a small community in south central New Mexico called Tularosa, which is about 40 miles the way the crows fly from the Trinity test site. I want to thank Tanya for inviting me today to share this history with you that has really never been told, the history of the people who lived adjacent to the Trinity test site. It's important to recognize, I think, from the very beginning of this presentation that New Mexico, while we're referred to as the land of enchantment, actually was long ago declared a sacrifice zone. And what that means is that we have the cradle to grave process in place here. The cradle being the fact that we open up the earth and we extract the uranium from the earth. And then we develop and test nuclear devices here. And then when it's all over, we take the waste and we put it back into the ground in New Mexico. So that is basically the cradle to grave process that takes place here. My goal today is to talk specifically about at least three things. First of all, the bomb itself and what made it so unique and so devastating to human health. Secondly, the lifestyles of the people in New Mexico in 1945 that meant we were maximally exposed to radiation. I want to talk about the compensation that's been set up since 1990 that has excluded the people of New Mexico. And then I would like to maybe talk just for a moment about the future of nuclear testing and the storage of waste, et cetera. And so let me just jump right into telling you about the test itself. So the test took place in the desert of south central New Mexico, and there's always been this misconception that that area was remote and uninhabited. And in reality, the government actually has perpetuated that false narrative that no one lived here and no one was harmed. But the truth of the matter is there were tens of thousands of people living in a 50-mile radius. And if you extend that radius about 150 miles, you actually encompass hundreds of thousands of people. And that will become important, and I'll explain that a little bit later in this discussion. So the bomb was the first nuclear device ever developed or tested. And because of that, there were things that were basically unknown. exposure to radiation was not an unknown factor. And actually, in researching this more, we've learned that the government did know a lot about radiation exposure and the harmful effects to human health. But what was not exactly known at the time of the bomb is things like how powerful it was going to be, what it would take to cause the fission process, etc. And so the bomb was overpacked with plutonium. They actually used 13 pounds of weapons grade plutonium when only 3 pounds of that, it was only maybe 15% efficient. So only 3 pounds of the plutonium actually fissioned. The remaining 10 pounds of weapons grade plutonium with a half-life of 24,000 years actually went up in a fireball that exceeded the atmosphere, went over 7 miles into the stratosphere. Now, the reason that that happened is because the bomb was placed on a platform 100 feet off the ground. The bomb actually came down, intercepted the Earth, created a crater, but not a significant crater, and then took up all this dirt, sand, animal and plant life, incinerated it because it actually produced more light and more heat than the sun, and then took that fireball, like I said, over 7 miles into the stratosphere. Now, we all know that when you produce something that goes up, especially that high into the stratosphere, it's all going to come back down. And so what happened for days afterwards is that an ash fell from the sky, a radioactive ash. And that ash coated everything. And the government actually followed the main part, or had an airplane follow the main part of the plume from New Mexico all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. So it crossed the entire United States as it went out to the Atlantic Ocean. You can imagine that as this ash fell from the sky, there were communities as close as 20 miles, 30 miles, 35 miles, and we've identified ranching families that lived as close as 12 miles to the test site. So you can imagine that as this ash fell from the sky, it got on everything. It got on, the earth, it got on the roofs of houses. It was then dispersed into the rivers, the lakes, the streams, the ditches. We really depended a lot on those sources of water for our sustenance, and I'll go into that in just a minute. So the government learned in doing the test at Trinity that they didn't want to repeat this, and they never repeated it actually. And they also learned that to take the bomb to Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they had to detonate it differently. They didn't want to create this massive fallout. They wanted to create destruction. And so when they went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they actually detonated those bombs at 1,600 feet and 1,800 feet respectively. What happened then is that the blast force came down and then went out laterally. It did intercept the Earth, but it didn't intercept the Earth the same way that the Trinity bomb did. So the blast power went out laterally and created this enormous destruction, but a much smaller fallout field because it didn't take this blast into the air the same way that the Trinity blast was actually detonated. The other thing to note is that the blast at Trinity was more powerful. Let me back up. The blast at Nagasaki, the bomb at Nagasaki, was based on the model used at Trinity, but the blast at Trinity was even more powerful than the blast at Nagasaki. So those are the unique qualities of the Trinity bomb and the Trinity test that led to this massive fallout field. And they had anticipated in the beginning, and the physicians and the meteorologists assigned to the project had already warned General Groves, who was in charge of the Manhattan Project, that there could likely be massive fallout and that it would obviously affect human health if that fallout got out of control. So the government actually sent the directors of the project, General Groves and others, actually set some limits of exposure at which time they would do some evacuation of towns and villages and close to the test site. Well, those levels of radiation were reached rather quickly, actually, using the very rudimentary Geiger counters that were developed to monitor the test. And so when they reached those limits very quickly after the test, they then doubled the limit and said, well, if it reaches this limit, we'll evacuate. And it reached that limit and they still didn't evacuate. And then it even went further than that, much further than that. I think it turned out that it was about 4 times higher, the actual radiation that was measured that day in towns around the Trinity test site. Actually became 4 times higher than the limit they had set for evacuation. And they never evacuated anybody. So they didn't warn people before, and they never warned people afterwards. And the truth of the matter is, even if they had said something to people afterwards, it wouldn't have really had meaning or context, because people didn't understand what it meant to be exposed to radiation, and they didn't understand how radiation exposure would affect you. And for example, there's a story in the literature about how afterwards they identified a ranching family that lived about inside that 15-mile radius to the test site, and they sent out people after the test to sort of monitor the family and find out how they were faring, because they knew they had been very overexposed to radiation. And when the rancher encountered these men in the Tyvek suits with the Geiger counters, he asked them what they were doing, and they said, we're checking for radiation. And he said, you won't find that here because we don't own a radio. And I know that sounds very naive, but in many ways, why wouldn't it be? Because no one had ever heard the word radiation. No one had ever been exposed to radiation. Nobody knew what the implications were. And so even if they had warned people afterwards, I don't think people would have known what precautions to take. And the government certainly wasn't interested in doing much to take care of people's health afterwards. So let me also talk about how afterwards the government, for example, rounded up some of the cattle that had been affected. So there were cattle grazing out in the New Mexico desert that morning. It was detonated at 5:29 and some odd seconds on the morning of July 16th, 1945. And some of those cows had their hide burned off of them. That was a very significant beta burn that they received. And so the government did confiscate some of those cows. But throughout the history of us working on this, we've recorded oral histories from people who have told us that they were from ranching and farming families. And when they went to the cattle sale that year, for example, everybody was sort of perplexed about why so many of the cows were half white or entirely white, and why so many of the cows had eye cancer. And obviously it was because they had no protection and they were out that day exposed to the radiation as it came down, directly exposed to the radiation as it came down. We had a gentleman, unfortunately, we lost that gentleman this summer. His name was Daryl Gilmore, bless his heart. He was a student at UNM, the University of New Mexico, and he always told me, while I don't remember experiencing the blast that morning, what I do remember vividly is that my parents had contacted me and asked me to bring the family car home to Tularosa because my brother was processing out of the Army in El Paso, and they needed the car to take him down to El Paso to process out of the Army. And he said that he drove from Albuquerque on a road that was paved, and he got to a certain place, and then he had to cut across the desert on a dirt road. And most of the roads back then were dirt roads. It's kind of hard to put your arms around sometimes, but a lot of the roadways in New Mexico in 1945 were still dirt roads. So he crossed the desert, and at one point he was probably as close as 8 miles to the actual test site. He said he remembers pulling over to check his tires and just make sure that everything was sound with the car. And then and it was July, so he had the windows down, no air conditioning in the car. He said it was a hot day. And he said that he encountered a convoy of soldiers who told him, get on the road, don't stop, keep your windows rolled up. There's poisonous gas in the air. And by the time Daryl made his way across the desert that day and made his way all the way down to Tularosa, where he was from, he had experienced beta burns. He had burns on his body, and he said it was like the worst sunburn he'd ever received. And he said, but what was so odd, it wasn't just like on my arms that were uncovered, or maybe my face. He said they were all over my body, even parts of my body that were covered that day by my clothing. One example of the exposures that people received that day, the government had such a lack of concern for human health that they didn't even block that roadway that day. The other thing that, another story that's been told to us is by a woman by the name of Barbara Kent. And Barbara was a young woman. She was 13 at the time, living in El Paso, Texas. And her mother and brother drove her to a camp in Ruidoso, New Mexico. Ruidoso is probably about 55 to 60 miles away from the test site. And they arrived on July 15th of the day before the test. And they dropped her off at a dance camp, and her brother and mother remained in Ruidoso, but they stayed in a motel. And she said that on the morning of July 16th, the explosion rocked their camp building, and they were knocked out of bed. And she said, of course, they were terrified because they didn't know what they had just experienced. And she said that once the camp host calmed them all down and they went back to bed, the next morning they woke up, or later in the morning, I'm sorry, they woke up and they went outside and there was an ash falling from the sky that looked like snow. And they all thought, how bizarre is this? Because it's July, how could it be snowing? And she says she remembers that they put their bathing suits on and made their way down to the river next to the camp, and they played in the water and they played with the ash that fell, and they were rubbing it on their faces and in their hair and even catching it on their tongue. They had no way of knowing that they were obviously exposing themselves to very high levels of radiation. And Barbara said afterwards she developed this white streak of hair that surrounded her face that never actually went away. And unfortunately, I think there were about 15 young ladies or 10 young ladies at the dance camp with her. They all, except for one, got cancer, including Barbara. Barbara got cancer. She's had 3 different cancers. She's had miscarriages, and her daughters all have cancer. Obviously, these aren't normal histories, but some stories that I wanted to share with you. Now, let me talk a little bit about the lifestyles of the people in 1945 that also meant we were maximally exposed. We had no running water in the villages and small towns around the Trinity test site. We collected water off the roofs of our homes into cisterns or holding tanks. And that is the water that was used for just about every purpose, but most significantly used for drinking, for cooking, for bathing, for cleaning, etc. So people were actually collecting the water off their rooftops into their cisterns in enclosed space. And as the ash fell from the sky onto their roofs, it became part of their water supply, never to be separated, actually, because once that ash got into the cistern, that enclosed space, it's there forever. The other thing that we didn't have in 1945 were grocery stores because we didn't have refrigeration. So that meant that everything that people consumed, they actually produced themselves. So everybody had a garden, an orchard, everybody had a dairy cow or a local dairy that they went to, or a goat that they utilized for the purposes of milk. They raised cattle, they raised pigs, sheep, chickens, and then they hunted to supplement their protein sources by hunting small mammals, birds, and all of this obviously would be so vastly contaminated. Once the soil was contaminated, everything they grew in the soil was contaminated. And then the animals, as they grazed on the grasses that had been coated with the radioactive fallout, also became exposed to radiation and contaminated. So, what you bought in a mercantile store were things like sugar, flour, coffee, rice, cereal, but you never bought produce, you never bought dairy, you never bought meat. So now their entire food supply was contaminated. The other thing I remind people of is that if you don't have running water, you also don't shower or bathe as often. And so that day, if the ash that came down from the sky and got on everything, got on your skin, you would have then had that there until the next time you were able to bathe, which could have been a number of days. And so people were ingesting the fallout, they were inhaling the fallout, and then they were absorbing the radiation through their skin. So we had this maximal exposure. And what we know now, because there was a study released in 2018, in 2019, there was a paper released, published in a scientific journal about the infant mortality rates in New Mexico the summer of 1945. After a steady 10-year decline in infant mortality, we saw these huge spikes in New Mexico in infant mortality. Babies were dying, and we had casualties from the Trinity test. Mothers were breastfeeding their babies. Mammals concentrate radiation in their mammary glands. And so mothers were breastfeeding their babies, and they were poisoning their babies. These babies didn't have the ability to overcome the radiation that they were consuming through their mother's milk. And so we saw these huge spikes in infant mortality. And there were health professionals that contacted the Manhattan Project and said, can you please tell us, is there something we should know about? Should we be doing something differently? We are losing lots of babies and we just don't know why. And could it be associated with the test, the radiation? And the Manhattan Project leadership, as they were contacted about this, decided to go ahead and dismiss and lie and not offer any support to the people in New Mexico as babies were dying. And I just find that unconscionable. I think that's the worst part of this, maybe one of the absolute worst things we've discovered. So there's always been this false narrative that nobody lived here and nobody was affected. And I mentioned earlier about the tens of thousands of people who lived in a 50-mile radius. After the test was done, the physicians assigned to the test said something to the effect of, and I won't get it exactly verbatim, but we can never do this here again because we so overexpose people to radiation. And if we do it again any place, we have to find an area with a 150-mile radius uninhabited. Well, that's what took them to the Nevada test site. Now, when I mention 150-mile radius around the Trinity test site, if you actually extend that out, it would encompass El Paso and parts of Mexico to the south, and it would encompass Albuquerque to the north. So that number that I mentioned earlier, tens of thousands of people, expands greatly when you encompass those two large cities to hundreds of thousands of people. It would essentially have been the entire state of New Mexico. Per their own admission, they would have to find a place with a 150-mile radius uninhabited. The other thing to note is that while there were monitors, soldiers in place in some of these small towns around the Trinity test site, the data that they collected that day on the rudimentary Geiger counters has never been made public. As a matter of fact, we don't know what happened to it. So we have no way of knowing how extensive this was because the government has no data that they've ever been able to produce. But what they did determine after Trinity is that when they went to Nevada, they would have to keep track of the exposures. And so there were monitors in place all across the Western United States, monitors in place in New Mexico. And the people of New Mexico were not only exposed to a great deal of radiation after the Trinity test, they were also exposed to radiation from the Nevada test site through the summer of 1962 as they did above ground testing. So I want to talk just very quickly about radiation exposure, a reduction in people's immunity associated with that, and also associated with being treated for cancer. Now, Tanya mentioned that I'm a cancer survivor. I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, and the first thing they asked me was, when were you exposed to radiation? And it was really interesting because that reaffirmed what I had been thinking for a very long time, that we had been overexposed to radiation as a result of the Trinity test. But in my own family, for example, I'm the fourth generation to have cancer since the 1945 test. Two of my great-grandfathers died from what they called stomach cancer back in 1955 at a time when no one had ever even heard the word cancer in our communities. Both my grandmothers had cancer, although that's not what they died from. And then my father, after suffering for over 8 years with 3 different cancers that he didn't have risk factors for, died from cancer. And that's my family. But we have well documented so many families that have now 6 generations of cancer in their families, that have young children who are suffering with cancer, and they're now the 6th generation. And we document this all the time. But when you've been treated for cancer and you have reduced immunity, you now become a special cohort inside of this pandemic, for example. And when we take a look at what's happening with New Mexico specifically, on the Navajo reservation, where they had a huge outbreak of the pandemic and where they had many deaths, those people are a special cohort because they were uranium miners and they had lung disease and they had cancer. And then this pandemic comes along and they're a special cohort that is differently affected than just the normal population. And so we have concerns for that. And that's, you know, a topic I could talk about for quite a while, but I just wanted to sort of bring that to everybody's attention because it is a part of what we're dealing with actually today in our society with the pandemic. I want to talk very quickly also about the fact that since 1990, there's been a fund developed called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to compensate the downwinders of the Nevada test site. And the people of New Mexico have never been included, even though we were downwinders of the Nevada test site. The compensation ends right at the Arizona-Nevada border. As if I always say there's a lead curtain there that exists to protect the people of New Mexico from the radiation that came from Nevada. We all know that that's not the truth, but if you live 5 feet into Arizona, you get taken care of. If you live 5 feet into New Mexico, you don't. So we've been working for over 10 years to get bills passed in Congress that would amend the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to take care of the people of New Mexico as well. Currently, there's a bill in Congress, it's HR 3783, House Bill 3783, that's under consideration, again, 10 years, and we've never had a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee where this is stalled. And so I never miss an opportunity to tell people, if you want to assist the downwinders of New Mexico who have never been recognized, acknowledged, or taken care of, please contact your congressional folks and ask them to support House Bill 3783. We have a companion bill in the Senate. It's Senate Bill 947. But the House bill is a little bit more extensive, and it's the bill that we would like to see passed. And your members of Congress, if they want to support this, can also be co-sponsors. The bills have bipartisan support and should have long ago made their way through Congress. The truth of the matter is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act will sunset in 2022. And this very heavy lift that we've been working on for all these years will become almost an impossibility if the bill is not amended to include us before the sunset. So please contact your members of Congress. Now, there's a couple of things I want to talk about in closing. The first one is that there's been discussions in our government as of late that we should resume nuclear testing. And I just want to say, as a member of a state and a community and a family that has its roots tied to being a downwinder, there is no safe process for testing nuclear weapons. They always present these things as though they're safe. And my response to that is, maybe they are right up until the moment that they're not. And when that moment takes place, it's usually catastrophic. And if anybody thinks that the government's going to come back and take care of the mess they've made, think again, because we've been waiting 75 years. And so in my mind, there is no safe place to test nuclear weapons. And many people, I recently participated in a Zoom seminar similar to this with downwinders from Kazakhstan and with downwinders from the Pacific Islands. And there is no part of our world that hasn't been affected by nuclear testing. And so I would say that we all need to be aware of this idea that nuclear testing might resume, and that we should all stand strongly against the idea of resuming nuclear testing. The other thing I want to bring to everybody's attention is that we talked earlier about the cradle to grave process in New Mexico. Well, New Mexico, unfortunately, is under consideration right now for a nuclear repository. It's called the Holtec Project or Holtec site. It would be in eastern New Mexico. And what they're proposing is bringing high-level nuclear waste, okay, from all parts of the United States where there are nuclear power plants, essentially, and they would take the spent fuel rods and bring those by rail car across the entire United States to a repository in New Mexico. This repository is supposed to be an interim site because the government doesn't have a permanent site chosen yet. but it makes no sense to take what is now buried and kept on site at these locations and then transport it across the country through major cities and through small cities, cities in general, all across the country, and then bring it to an interim site where someday it will, I suppose, I believe that once it gets placed here, it'll remain here. Suppose that someday they would then again remove it and take it by rail car someplace else. It makes no sense. We have to come up with other ideas and other processes for dealing with this nuclear waste, but just bringing it here where we don't even produce any of it, I don't think is any kind of responsible solution. And I really want to say, sort of in closing, that New Mexico has done its part, and everybody should be against the idea of transporting nuclear waste that they can't secure on every mile of railway across the United States to New Mexico. So I think in closing, I'd just like to say that we, the people of New Mexico, were horribly exposed to radiation, and the government has walked away for 75 years. And there is a moral and an ethical imperative to correct this, to make this right. And if we are complacent in this, then it makes us complicit. And so all of us have a moral obligation to reach out, to make sure that Congress knows that this is something that's important to all of us, that we go back and take care of the problems that we've created, and that we also always keep in mind how people's lives are affected when nuclear testing takes place, and it's not something that we should ever revert back to. And so with that, I think I will close and ask if there are any questions. Thank you so much.
Tina, thank you so much. We're really happy to have you here this morning because, as you said, this isn't a history that many in the United States are aware of, and it's really important for us to examine the legacies. And as you've talked very compellingly about the current impact of nuclear waste, and to really reflect upon nuclear energy is now being posed as a green solution. And as you're talking about, we simply don't, in addition to some of the nuclear processes being very carbon intensive, we simply don't know about how to deal with this waste in ways that are safe and that don't impact marginalized communities or create significant environmental issues. So thank you so much for that. There are a few questions that came in while you were speaking, and so I'm going to read those to you. One of the first questions was about the Manhattan Project, and how do we hold the Manhattan Project? How do we deal with responsibility and accountability that was the result of the Manhattan Project and the harms that were done?
Well, it's basically what I said at the end. We all have a moral and an ethical obligation to actually do something positive now about what's taken place, and that's holding our Congress accountable for this. They ultimately will be the people that say, yes, we need to acknowledge this happened. My mom often says, why are they so afraid of the truth? And that's a great way to sort of get to the heart of it. This is the truth of what happened. This is how people were harmed. And we need to hold Congress accountable for that, especially as there's these discussions about resuming nuclear testing. And so I think everybody should know about this history, should be aware of it, and should contact their members of Congress and say, there was damage done to American citizens as a result of the Manhattan Project. And those people have never been acknowledged or assisted with the health problems they have. When you live in a state like New Mexico, where most of the state is rural, people have a lack of access to health care. There aren't healthcare facilities available to us. So when we get sick, we always have to travel someplace to be diagnosed, to be treated. And what happens is it truly does, people end up expending all their resources to take care of their health. And I fully believe, because I've spent 15 years on this, and I've talked to so many people in so many communities, and I've documented so many histories through our health surveying process, I truly believe it's had a huge economic impact on our state. Our state suffers from this cycle of poverty that we can't seem to break out of. And I always say, if somebody spends all their resources to take care of their health, they never have an opportunity then to generate any kind of generational wealth that might, for example, allow them to assist a child or a grandchild to go to college or buy a home or do any of the other things that are part of the American dream. And so if somebody wants to know how to address this, it's that they have to put pressure on their members of Congress, and Congress needs to hear from people from throughout the country. Recently, I was invited to participate in a conversation with Representative Nadler from New York, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and he was very responsive to the story, the history. He didn't know, like most people, about the harm that was done to us, and he agreed that he would schedule a hearing. But people from New York, living in New York, can reach out to his office and say, look, Representative Nadler, it's time for that hearing. It's time. And so there's a lot that people can do. But if you remain complacent, then you are complicit in the damage that was done from the beginning.
Great. We'll move on to the next question. Another person who's listening commented, Ms. Cordova, thank you for this informative presentation. Can you speak about the leadership in Congress who are advocating for the HB 3783 and Senate Bill 945? Can we point to these leaders when we contact our own Congress people?
So just to correct, it's HR 3783, and then it's S947, not 945. The primary sponsor of the House bill is our representative, Ben Ray Lujan, but there are countless co-sponsors. Our entire congressional delegation from New Mexico supports the bills. In the Senate, the primary sponsor is Senator Crapo from Idaho, and that's because Senator Crapo wants to add additional counties in Idaho to the compensation. Again, there's bipartisan support for the Senate bill. But we had a hearing in the Senate. The Senate Judiciary Committee at the time was led by Senator Grassley. He has been replaced by Senator Graham, Lindsey Graham. We never got a vote in the Senate after the Senate hearing. So we need to pressure Senator Graham and the Senate Judiciary Committee to bring this up for a vote. And then again, on the House side, we need to apply pressure to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which is Representative Nadler out of New York.
Thank you very much. Another student has commented, why don't you think I've never heard about nuclear waste. Why don't you think we know about these issues?
So the Holtec site that I mentioned earlier that's under consideration in New Mexico, which, by the way, our governor, our lieutenant governor, all of our congressional folks, and most people in New Mexico are not in favor of the Holtec site. But oftentimes we don't get to weigh in on these things. I mean, we are weighing in, we are making our objections known, but at the end of the day, the federal government is going to make a decision about whether this is accepted or not. There's a lot of money involved in this, and everybody has to realize that money drives a lot of these processes. And Holtec is not going to be a government site. It's going to be run by private industry. And that's even scarier as far as I'm concerned, because what I said earlier was that as they transport this waste across the country, they can't guarantee that it's going to be safe making its way on rail cars. And I was in one of these meetings where people, the public, were able to come forward and bring up their concerns. And a woman said, wouldn't one of those rail cars be a target for a terrorist act, an act of terrorism? And she said, so I want to know, how are you going to protect that nuclear waste as it makes its way across the country on every square inch of railway? And there is no protection. It will absolutely be under consideration for a terrorist group. Yeah, and they're private industry. So if there is a major incident, we all know that historically, private industry has never stepped forward to take care of their messes, and they're not going to take care of a mess like this. They'll file bankruptcy, it'll get tied up in the courts. Those kinds of processes will take place. We're not guaranteed of a good outcome whatsoever. And I always say, if the government's ignored us for 75 years, private industry will ignore us for the remainder of time. And the reason you don't know about these things is because there's so much money driving it.
Tina, could you please repeat those bill numbers that you mentioned earlier?
Yes, absolutely. It's House Bill HR 3783, 3783, and Senate Bill S 947.
Thank you so much. So we are at the end of the Q&A. If you want to leave further questions in the comments section, I'm sure Tina would be happy to look at them, and if she's able to respond there. Thank you so much for all of those who participated and left comments and questions. We are going to move from the plenary talk now into the concurrent sessions of the symposium. Yes, Tina, sorry.
I just want to say one thing, and I was remiss. Please visit our website. It's www.trinitydownwinders.com. There's all the information you'll ever want to know about us, and I normally forget to mention that, and I didn't want to close out without mentioning that. Thank you, Tanya.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who is viewing this morning.